A billionaire's world shatters when he sees his ex-wife serving tables while pregnant. What he discovers next will change everything forever. The crystal chandeliers of Belmont's fine dining cast dancing shadows across the mahogany walls as Marcus Sterling adjusted his platinum watch. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversations of the city's elite, each table representing millions in net worth. At 38, Marcus had built an empire that most could only dream of, his business dealings spanning continents and his influence reaching the highest circles of society. "Darling, you seem distracted tonight," Victoria purred from across their private table, her manicured fingers tracing the rim of her champagne glass. The diamonds around her neck caught the light, a gift from Marcus that cost more than most people's annual salary. Marcus forced his signature smile, the one that had closed billion-dollar deals and charmed investors worldwide. "Just finalizing the Henderson acquisition in my mind. You know how it is." But that wasn't entirely true. Something felt different tonight, an inexplicable unease that had nothing to do with business. He'd chosen Belmont specifically because it represented everything he'd achieved: exclusivity, power, success. The kind of place where reservations were made months in advance and the wine list read like a collector's catalog. "The Henderson merger will make you the youngest billionaire in the shipping industry," Victoria continued, her voice carrying that familiar note of admiration mixed with calculation. "We should celebrate properly tonight." Marcus nodded absently, his attention drawn to the seamless service around them. Servers moved like shadows, anticipating every need before it was voiced. It was precision he appreciated, having built his entire life around such attention to detail. Then the world stopped. A figure approached their table carrying a bottle of their requested vintage, and Marcus felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with his regular gym routine. The server moved with a careful grace, one hand steadying what appeared to be a rounded silhouette beneath the uniform. When she looked up, Marcus's carefully constructed world crumbled in an instant. Elena. His Elena. The woman whose laughter had once filled his penthouse apartment, whose gentle hands had straightened his ties before important meetings, whose tears had been the last thing he'd seen before walking out of their marriage without looking back. But this wasn't the Elena he remembered. Gone was the radiant woman who had graced charity galas at his side, replaced by someone who looked as though life had tested her beyond measure. Her hair, once styled by the city's most exclusive salons, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face, though still beautiful, carried lines of exhaustion that makeup couldn't completely hide, and she was unmistakably pregnant. "Good evening." Elena's voice trembled slightly as she reached their table, her professional mask firmly in place. "I have your bottle of Chateau Margaux as requested." Marcus couldn't speak. His throat felt as though someone had filled it with concrete. The woman he'd once promised to love forever was standing before him, carrying a child, working as a server in the very restaurant where he'd once proposed to her years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. This table, this exact spot, was where he'd gotten down on one knee with a ring worth more than most people's homes, where Elena had said yes through tears of joy, where they'd planned a future that seemed as solid as the marble floors beneath their feet. "Marcus!" Victoria's voice cut through his paralysis. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Elena's eyes met his then, and in that moment, years of careful emotional barriers crumbled. He saw recognition flash across her features, followed immediately by something that looked like panic. Her hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly, a protective gesture that sent a knife through Marcus's chest. "Sir?" Elena addressed him directly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like me to pour the wine?" The formality of it, the way she called him sir as though they were strangers, felt like a physical blow. This was the woman who had once whispered his name in the darkness of their bedroom, who had believed in his dreams when he was just another ambitious young man with big plans and empty pockets. Marcus started, then stopped. What could he possibly say? That seeing her like this was destroying him? That every successful deal, every milestone achieved, suddenly felt meaningless? That he'd spent years convincing himself he'd made the right choice in leaving? Victoria's laugh broke the tension, though she clearly sensed something was wrong. "Darling, the poor girl is waiting. Just let her pour the wine." Elena's hands shook almost imperceptibly as she opened the bottle with practiced efficiency. Marcus watched her every movement, noting how she favored her left side, how she took a small breath before bending forward, how her uniform didn't quite fit properly over her changing figure. Questions hammered through his mind like a relentless storm. How long had she been working here? Where was the father of her child? Why was she on her feet for hours when she should be resting? The Elena, he remembered, had been a successful art curator at one of the city's premier galleries. She'd been passionate about her work, respected in her field. As she poured the deep red wine into his glass, a drop splashed onto the white tablecloth. Elena's face flushed with embarrassment, and she quickly reached for her napkin. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, dabbing at the stain. "I'll have this cleaned immediately." "It's fine," Marcus managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Really, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. None of this was nothing. The woman he'd once loved beyond reason was apologizing for a wine stain while carrying another man's child, working a job that had her on her feet all day when she should be taking care of herself. Elena finished pouring Victoria's glass and stepped back, her professional composure barely masking what Marcus recognized as deep exhaustion. "Is there anything else I can get for you this evening?" she asked, addressing the table generally while carefully avoiding Marcus's gaze. "Actually," Victoria interjected, oblivious to the tension crackling between Marcus and Elena, "could you recommend something from the dessert menu? I have such a sweet tooth tonight." Elena nodded, launching into a description of the restaurant's signature dishes with the kind of detailed knowledge that spoke of genuine dedication to her work. As she spoke, Marcus found himself studying her profile, noting how pregnancy had softened some of her features while sharpening others. She was beautiful still, perhaps more so for the strength he could see in the set of her shoulders, the determined way she carried herself despite obvious fatigue. This wasn't the sheltered woman he'd left behind. This was someone who had faced challenges and survived them. When she finished her recommendations and turned to leave, Marcus felt panic rise in his chest. He couldn't let her walk away again, not without knowing what had happened, not without understanding how his successful former wife had ended up serving tables while pregnant. "Wait!" he called out, louder than intended. Elena froze, her back still turned to him. "I'd like to speak with the manager," Marcus continued, improvising desperately. "About the service. It's been exceptional." Elena turned slowly, confusion and something that might have been fear flickering across her features. "I'll send James right over," she said quietly. As she walked away, Marcus watched her go, noting how she paused briefly at another table, pressing her hand to her lower back in a gesture that spoke of pain being carefully hidden. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Marcus, what's going on? You're acting very strangely." But Marcus couldn't answer. His mind was reeling with implications, with questions that demanded answers. The successful, independent woman he'd married had somehow ended up here, pregnant, and working a service job. What had happened to her career, her savings, the settlement from their divorce? More importantly, where was the father of her child, and why wasn't he taking care of her? James appeared at their table within minutes, a distinguished man with silver hair and the kind of genuine smile that spoke of years in hospitality. His presence commanded respect without arrogance, the mark of someone who had earned his position through dedication rather than connections. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," James said, extending his hand. "I'm James Morrison, the general manager. I understand you wanted to speak with me about our service tonight?" Marcus stood, accepting the handshake while his mind raced. He needed information about Elena, but he couldn't appear too interested without raising suspicions. "Yes, the service has been outstanding, particularly our server this evening. Very professional, very knowledgeable." "Ah, you must mean Elena," James replied, and Marcus caught something in his tone, protective, almost paternal. "She's one of our finest team members, very dedicated to her work." Victoria sipped her wine, clearly bored by the conversation. "Marcus, darling, surely this can wait. Our dinner is getting cold." But Marcus pressed on, ignoring Victoria's complaint. "She seems very experienced. Has she been with the restaurant long?" James's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Several months now. She came to us with excellent references and has quickly become invaluable to our team. Is there something specific about the service you'd like to discuss?" No, Marcus backtracked quickly. Just wanted to ensure she receives proper recognition. Attention to detail is important in any business. As James excused himself, Marcus settled back into his chair, but his appetite had completely vanished. Through the dining room's elegant atmosphere, he caught glimpses of Elena moving between tables, her movements careful and measured. Each time she appeared in his peripheral vision, his chest tightened with a mixture of longing and guilt he hadn't felt in years. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous," Victoria announced, cutting into her salmon with more force than necessary. "It's just the help." "Why are you so interested in some pregnant waitress?" The casual dismissal in Victoria's voice made Marcus's jaw clench. "She's not just the help, Victoria. She's a human being doing an honest job." Victoria laughed, a sound that suddenly grated against his nerves like nails on glass. "How noble of you. Though I suppose everyone has to work somewhere. Not everyone can be blessed with your success." The irony was suffocating. Victoria had no idea she was talking about his ex-wife, the woman who had once shared his dreams and supported his ambitions when he was building his empire from nothing. Elena had been there through the late nights, the failed deals, the moments when bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Across the restaurant, Marcus watched Elena approach a table of business executives. One of them, clearly having had too much to drink, made a comment that caused Elena to step back slightly. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could read her body language, the forced smile, the subtle defensive posture, the way her hand moved protectively over her belly. Something primal surged through Marcus, an anger so fierce it surprised him. He half rose from his chair before catching himself, remembering where he was, who was watching. But the protective instinct remained, burning in his chest like a live coal. "I need some air," Marcus announced abruptly, standing and tossing his napkin onto the table. "What?" Victoria looked up in confusion. "Marcus, we haven't even finished our main course. What's gotten into you tonight?" "5 minutes," he said, already moving away from the table. "I'll be right back." Marcus made his way through the restaurant, ostensibly heading toward the terrace, but his route took him past the service station where Elena was preparing drinks. She didn't notice him at first, focused on her task with the kind of concentration that spoke of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. Up close, he could see more than he'd been able to from their table. The slight tremor in her hands that suggested exhaustion. The way she leaned against the counter when she thought no one was looking. The careful way she moved, as though every motion required thought and planning. "Elena," he said softly. She looked up, startled, and for a moment her professional mask slipped entirely. He saw fear there, and something else. A vulnerability that made his heart ache with memories of who they used to be together. "Mr. Sterling," she said carefully, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "Is there something wrong with your meal?" The formality was like a knife twist. This woman had once called him by pet names, had traced his face with loving fingers, had shared his bed and his dreams. Now she couldn't even use his first name. "Elena, what happened?" The words came out before he could stop them. "Your career, your life? How did you end up here?" Her face went pale, then flushed with what looked like shame. "I don't know what you mean. This is my job and I'm good at it." "You were an art curator," Marcus pressed, stepping closer but still maintaining proper distance. "You had your own gallery showing planned. You were passionate about contemporary sculpture, Renaissance paintings. You knew more about art history than most university professors." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back quickly. "That was a long time ago. People change. Circumstances change. Not people like you," Marcus insisted. "You lived and breathed art. You could spend hours discussing the symbolism in a single painting. What happened to that passion?" "Passion doesn't pay bills," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dreams don't keep you fed or housed." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. What had happened to the settlement money from their divorce? He'd made sure she received enough to live comfortably for years, to pursue her career without financial pressure. Where had it gone? "Elena, I need to know." "Know what?" she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "Know how the successful, independent woman you married fell this far? Know how someone with a master's degree in art history ended up serving wine to people who probably spend more on a single bottle than I make in a week?" Her words carried years of accumulated pain, and Marcus felt each one like a physical assault. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for her when he'd walked away. In his mind, she'd moved on, found someone better suited to her gentle nature, built the family-focused life she'd always wanted. "I never wanted this for you," he said quietly. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What you wanted stopped mattering the day you decided our marriage was inconvenient for your business goals." Before Marcus could respond, James appeared beside them, his expression carefully neutral but alert. "Elena, is everything all right here? Mrs. Patterson at table 12 is asking about her wine selection." "Of course," Elena said quickly, straightening her posture. "I'll be right there." James's gaze shifted to Marcus, and there was something protective, almost warning in his eyes. "Mr. Sterling, I believe your companion is looking for you." The dismissal was polite, but clear. Marcus nodded, understanding that James had witnessed enough to recognize potential trouble. As Elena hurried away to attend to her other customers, Marcus found himself standing alone by the service station, surrounded by the sounds of success and celebration, while feeling more isolated than he had in years. When he returned to his table, Victoria was finishing her wine and checking her phone with obvious irritation. "Finally," she said without looking up, "I was beginning to think you'd abandoned me entirely, though the sommelier did come by with some interesting recommendations for after dinner." Marcus sat down mechanically, but the elaborate meal before him might as well have been cardboard. All he could think about was Elena's trembling hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she'd spoken about passion not paying bills. Something had gone terribly wrong in her life, and despite telling himself for years that her happiness wasn't his responsibility anymore, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow to blame. The evening continued around him, Victoria chattering about upcoming social events, other diners celebrating their various successes. But Marcus felt as though he was watching it all through glass, disconnected from a world that had suddenly lost its meaning. The remainder of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and untouched food. Marcus mechanically responded to Victoria's chatter about upcoming charity galas and weekend plans, but his attention remained fixed on Elena's movements throughout the dining room. Every time she appeared, carrying trays with careful precision, or explaining menu items to other patrons, he felt the weight of unspoken history pressing against his chest. When Victoria excused herself to the powder room, Marcus seized his opportunity. He signaled to James, who approached with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. "Mr. Sterling, how can I assist you?" "I'd like to settle our account," Marcus said, sliding his platinum card across the table. "And I have a question about your hiring practices." James's expression remained professionally neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tension around his eyes. "Our hiring practices? Your employee, Elena. Her background seems quite distinguished for restaurant service. I'm curious about her previous experience." The older man studied Marcus for a long moment before responding. "Elena came to us during a difficult period in her life. She needed work, and we needed someone with her dedication and intelligence. That's all I'm comfortable sharing." "A difficult period?" Marcus pressed, keeping his voice low. James glanced toward the dining room, then back to Marcus. "Mr. Sterling, I don't typically discuss our staff's personal circumstances with customers. However, since you seem genuinely concerned..." He paused, weighing his words carefully. "Elena arrived here several months ago with excellent references but no recent work history. She was clearly overqualified for the position, but she needed immediate employment. What happened to her previous career?" "That's not my story to tell," James replied firmly. "But I will say this. She's one of the hardest working people I've ever employed. She never complains, never asks for special treatment despite her condition, and treats every customer with respect, regardless of how they treat her." The emphasis on the last point carried clear meaning. James had witnessed enough interactions to recognize when wealthy patrons looked down on service staff. The protective undertone in his voice suggested he'd taken Elena under his wing, perhaps recognizing that her circumstances were more complex than they appeared. "Her condition," Marcus repeated. "The pregnancy. Is she receiving proper medical care?" James's expression shifted from professional caution to something approaching surprise. "That's an unusual question from a customer, Mr. Sterling." Before Marcus could respond, Victoria returned, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "Darling, are we ready to leave? I have an early spa appointment tomorrow." Marcus nodded absently, but as James processed his payment, the manager leaned slightly closer. "If you're genuinely concerned about Elena's welfare, he said quietly. Perhaps you should consider that working here, while challenging, provides her with something many in her situation lack: dignity and independence. The words hit Marcus with unexpected force. Dignity and independence. Two things Elena had always valued. Two things that had made their relationship so strong in the beginning. She'd never wanted to be taken care of. She'd wanted to be an equal partner. As they prepared to leave, Marcus caught sight of Elena clearing a table across the room. She moved slowly, one hand pressed briefly to her lower back, in a gesture that spoke of physical strain. The sight made his chest tighten with a mixture of admiration and concern that he couldn't quite name. "Marcus, the car is here," Victoria announced, checking her phone. But Marcus wasn't ready to leave, wasn't ready to return to his penthouse apartment and pretend this evening hadn't changed everything. He needed answers, needed to understand how the confident, successful woman he'd married had ended up in circumstances that required her to work on her feet while pregnant. "You go ahead," he told Victoria. "I have some business calls to make. I'll catch up with you later." Victoria's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Business calls? At this hour?" "International markets," Marcus improvised. "Tokyo opens in a few hours." After Victoria left with obvious reluctance, Marcus lingered in the restaurant's elegant lobby, waiting. The dinner service was winding down, and he knew Elena's shift would end soon. He positioned himself near the entrance where he could observe without being obvious about it. When Elena finally emerged from the service area, she looked even more exhausted than before. She'd changed from her server's uniform into simple street clothes, and the contrast only emphasized how different her life had become. Gone were the designer outfits and professional styling he remembered. In their place was the practical wardrobe of someone who counted every dollar. She paused near the staff exit, speaking quietly with James. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the respectful affection between them. Not romantic, but the kind of mentor-student relationship that develops when someone older recognizes potential in someone younger who's facing adversity. As Elena stepped outside into the cool evening air, Marcus followed at a discreet distance. He told himself he just wanted to ensure she got home safely, but the truth was more complicated. Seeing her again had awakened emotions he'd spent years suppressing, questions he'd convinced himself didn't matter anymore. Elena walked to a bus stop 2 blocks from the restaurant, settling onto the bench with the careful movements of someone whose body was carrying more weight than it was used to. Under the streetlight, Marcus could see the exhaustion etched in her features, the way she rubbed her temples as though fighting a headache. When the bus arrived, Elena climbed aboard slowly, finding a seat near the front. Marcus watched through the windows as the vehicle pulled away, carrying her toward whatever modest home she could afford on a server's wages. Standing alone on the sidewalk, Marcus felt the full weight of what he'd witnessed. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for Elena when he'd walked away from their marriage. In his mind, she'd moved on quickly, found someone who appreciated her gentle nature and desire for family, built the stable, loving home she'd always wanted. Instead, she was alone, pregnant, and working a physically demanding job that barely covered her basic needs. The settlement money from their divorce should have prevented this kind of financial struggle, which meant something had gone seriously wrong in her life after he'd left. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his private investigator. David Chen had handled sensitive inquiries for Marcus's business dealings for years, always with complete discretion and thorough results. "David, it's Marcus Sterling. I need you to look into someone for me. Quietly and completely." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. What's the subject's name?" "Elena Morrison." He paused, realizing he'd automatically used her maiden name, the one she'd probably returned to after their divorce. "She used to be Elena Sterling. I need to know everything about her life over the past few years. Financial records, employment history, medical records if possible." "This sounds personal, Mr. Sterling. Are you sure you want to go down this path?" David's warning carried the wisdom of someone who'd seen how information could destroy as easily as it could inform. But Marcus was beyond caring about the potential consequences. "I'm sure. And David, this is priority 1. I need answers as soon as possible." After ending the call, Marcus stood in the empty street, surrounded by the glittering lights of a city that had given him everything he'd thought he wanted. Success, wealth, influence, respect, All of it felt hollow compared to the memory of Elena's tired smile and protective hand over her unborn child. For the first time in years, Marcus Sterling, master of his universe, felt completely powerless. David Chen's call came at dawn, piercing through Marcus's restless sleep like a blade through silk. The investigator's voice carried the weight of discoveries that would reshape everything Marcus thought he knew about Elena's life after their divorce. "Mr. Sterling, you need to sit down for this." Marcus was already pacing his penthouse office, unable to remain still since returning from the restaurant. The city sprawled below him through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the view that usually filled him with satisfaction now felt like a prison of glass and steel. "Just tell me everything, David." Elena's story begins about 18 months after your divorce was finalized. She'd been working at the Metropolitan Gallery of Contemporary Arts, building quite a reputation as a curator. She had a solo exhibition planned featuring emerging artists from underrepresented communities. The art world was taking notice. Marcus felt a flicker of pride despite everything. That was the Elena he remembered. Passionate, dedicated, always fighting for artists who needed advocates. What happened to derail that? David's pause stretched uncomfortably long. She fell in love. A man named Thomas Hartwell, claiming to be an art collector and philanthropist. Sophisticated, charming, seemingly wealthy. He courted her intensively, promising to fund her exhibition and support her career ambitions. The name meant nothing to Marcus, but something in David's tone suggested it should. "Go on." Hartwell convinced Elena to leave her gallery position to start an independent consultancy. He provided the startup capital, handled the business finances, even helped her secure a loan against her divorce settlement to expand operations. Everything seemed perfect until what? Until Thomas Hartwell disappeared with every penny she had. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He stopped pacing, gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "Gone without a trace, along with her business funds, her settlement money, and her professional reputation. But here's the devastating part. Hartwell wasn't even his real name. The man was a professional con artist named Robert Vance, with a history of targeting successful women in major cities. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. Elena, his careful, intelligent Elena, had been systematically destroyed by a predator who'd recognized her vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. "There's more," David continued relentlessly. "The pregnancy. According to medical records I was able to access, she discovered she was carrying his child just weeks before he vanished. When she tried to track him down, she learned the truth about his identity." The room seemed to be closing in around Marcus. Elena hadn't just lost her money, she'd lost everything while carrying the child of a man who'd never existed except as an elaborate lie. "How much did she lose?" "Everything, Mr. Sterling. The settlement from your divorce, her savings, the loan she'd taken against future earnings. She was left with massive debt, no income, and nowhere to turn. The art world closed ranks against her when the financial scandal broke, assuming she was either complicit or incompetent." Marcus sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Elena's fall. In trying to build an independent life, she'd been systematically destroyed by someone who'd studied her dreams and weaponized them against her. The pregnancy complications? Stress-related, high blood pressure, early labor scares. She's been working multiple jobs trying to stay afloat while carrying a child. The restaurant job is actually her second employment. She cleans office buildings before dawn to make ends meet. The image of Elena scrubbing floors before serving tables hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest. The woman who'd once been invited to lecture at prestigious universities was now working 2 physically demanding jobs while pregnant, all because she'd trusted someone who'd seen her as a mark rather than a person. Where is she living? A studio apartment in Riverside District. Rent-controlled, barely habitable, but it's what she can afford. The building has code violations, but she can't complain because she needs the below-market rent. Marcus knew Riverside District. He'd grown up there before his business success lifted him into a different world entirely. It was a place people escaped from, not a destination for someone with Elena's education and background. "David, I need you to find out everything about this Robert Vance character. Where he is, what he's done since Elena, everything. Already working on it, but Mr. Sterling, what are you planning to do with this information?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished flame. What was he planning to do? Eleanor's pride would never allow her to accept direct charity from him. Their history was too complicated, their divorce too bitter. But knowing she was struggling while he lived in luxury felt like slowly drowning in guilt and regret. I don't know yet, but I can't do nothing. After ending the call, Marcus stood at his windows watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, Elena was probably starting her early shift, cleaning offices in buildings not unlike the one where he lived in comfort. The injustice of it burned through him like acid. His phone rang again. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. The shallow concerns of his current social circle felt meaningless compared to Elena's real struggles. How could he discuss charity galas and wine tastings when the woman he'd once loved was working herself into exhaustion just to survive? Instead, Marcus called his lawyer. "Jonathan, I need you to research something for me. A man named Robert Vance, also known as Thomas Hartwell. I want to know if there are any legal avenues to recover money he stole from his victims." This sounds personal, Marcus. Are you involved in some kind of fraud case? Not directly, but someone I care about was targeted by this individual. I want to explore every possible option for recovery. I'll look into it, but these types of cases are notoriously difficult. If the perpetrator has hidden assets or fled jurisdiction, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Try anyway. Money is no object. After several more calls to business associates and legal contacts, Marcus found himself staring at a problem that couldn't be solved with his usual tools of wealth and influence. Elena's situation required something more delicate, more personal. He thought about their conversation at the restaurant, the way she'd flinched when he'd approached, the careful distance she'd maintained even while clearly recognizing him. She wasn't just financially vulnerable, she was emotionally shattered, carrying the weight of betrayal alongside her unborn child. A plan began forming in Marcus's mind, fragile and uncertain but driven by a need to act that overwhelmed his usual calculated caution. He couldn't undo Elena's suffering, couldn't erase the trauma of being systematically deceived and abandoned, but perhaps he could create opportunities for her to rebuild on her own terms. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed James Morrison at the restaurant. "Mr. Morrison, this is Marcus Sterling. I'd like to discuss a potential business proposition with you. Something that might benefit your establishment and one of your employees." "I'm listening, Mr. Sterling." "I'm planning a corporate event, something significant that would require extensive planning and coordination. I'm wondering if Elena might be interested in taking on additional responsibilities beyond her current role." James was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Sterling, may I ask why you're specifically interested in Elena's career development?" The directness of the question demanded an honest answer. "Because I believe she's capable of much more than serving tables, and I'd like to see her have the opportunity to prove it." "And this has nothing to do with the fact that you seemed quite interested in her welfare last evening?" Marcus closed his eyes, realizing he'd underestimated James's perceptiveness. "It has everything to do with that. But I'm not offering charity, Mr. Morrison. I'm offering opportunity. There's a difference." "Indeed there is. Let me speak with Elena about this possibility. But Mr. Sterling, if your intentions are anything other than professional, I'll make sure she declines immediately." "Understood. My intentions are to give her a chance to use her actual skills and intelligence, not to serve wine to people who don't appreciate either." After ending the call, Marcus felt the first glimmer of hope he'd experienced since seeing Elena the night before. He couldn't fix what had been broken, couldn't erase the months of struggle and humiliation she'd endured, but perhaps he could help create a path forward that honored both her capabilities and her dignity. The morning sun climbed higher over the city, and somewhere in its light, Elena was beginning another day of survival. But if Marcus had his way, her days of merely surviving were numbered. It was time for Elena to remember who she really was, beneath the weight of circumstance and betrayal. Elena stared at the envelope James had handed her, her name written in elegant script across cream-colored paper. The restaurant's afternoon lull provided a rare moment of quiet, but her mind raced with possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. "What is this about?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer had everything to do with the previous evening's encounter with Marcus. James settled into the chair across from her in the small break room, his expression carefully neutral. "A business opportunity. Someone wants to hire you for event planning consultation." "Event planning?" Elena almost laughed at the absurdity. "James, I serve tables and clean offices. I haven't planned anything more elaborate than my grocery shopping in months. Read the proposal first, then we'll discuss it. Elena opened the envelope with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing the expensive stationery that spoke of serious business intentions. As she read, her confusion deepened into something approaching disbelief. The letter outlined a corporate celebration for Sterling Enterprises' latest acquisition, a week-long series of events requiring cultural programming, art curation, and sophisticated coordination. The compensation offered was more than she earned in 6 months at the restaurant. "This is impossible," Elena whispered, rereading the figures to ensure she hadn't misunderstood. "No one pays this kind of money for event planning consultation, unless they value expertise over current circumstances," James replied carefully. "The client specifically requested someone with your background in art curation and cultural programming." Elena's hands began to shake as the implications sank in. "James, this is from Marcus Sterling's company. This isn't a legitimate job offer. It's charity disguised as business. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's recognition that you possess skills this city's corporate elite actually need." "You don't understand." Elena stood abruptly, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "Marcus was my husband. Our divorce wasn't exactly amicable. This isn't about my qualifications. It's about his guilt." James remained seated, watching her with the patience of someone accustomed to managing emotional situations. "Elena, may I ask you something personal?" She nodded, though every instinct screamed warnings about where this conversation was heading. "When you applied here, you were clearly overqualified and desperate. I hired you because I recognized someone fighting to maintain dignity while circumstances tried to strip it away. In these months, I've watched you work harder than people half your age, never complaining despite obvious physical discomfort." Elena sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of constant struggle. "But I've also watched you light up whenever customers discuss art, or when you see paintings in the dining room. You transform into someone entirely different, confident, knowledgeable, passionate. That person still exists beneath the survival mode you've been operating in. That person couldn't protect herself from being completely destroyed by someone she trusted," Elena replied bitterly. "That person was naive enough to believe in promises that turned out to be lies. That person was betrayed by a criminal," James corrected firmly. "There's a significant difference." Elena stared at the proposal, seeing not opportunity, but humiliation. Accepting meant acknowledging that Marcus had investigated her circumstances, discovered her downfall, and decided to intervene. The thought of his pity was almost unbearable. "What if I fail?" she asked quietly. "What if I take this job and prove that I really am as incompetent as everyone thinks? What if you succeed and remember who you were before circumstance convinced you otherwise?" The question hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elena thought about the studio apartment where she'd spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life had become so small. She thought about the office buildings she cleaned before dawn, scrubbing away other people's waste while her unborn child pressed against her ribs. But she also thought about the moments when customers mentioned art exhibitions or cultural events, and she felt the old excitement stir despite her circumstances. Those brief flashes when her mind engaged with ideas instead of just survival. "The compensation," she said finally. "It's enough to change everything," James finished. "Enough to move somewhere decent, to prepare properly for the baby, to rebuild your professional reputation, or enough to make my fall even more spectacular when I inevitably disappoint everyone." James leaned forward, his voice carrying decades of experience managing people through difficult decisions. "Elena, I've been in hospitality for 30 years. I've seen people from every background, every level of success and failure. What I see in you isn't someone who's lost her capabilities. It's someone who's forgotten she ever had them." Elena reread the proposal, noting details that suggested Marcus had crafted this opportunity specifically around her strengths. Art curation for the corporate spaces, cultural programming that would showcase emerging artists, coordination with museums and galleries throughout the city. It was exactly the kind of work she dreamed of doing before Thomas Hartwell had convinced her to abandon security for independence, then stolen both. "There's something else," James said gently. The proposal specifies that you'd work directly with department heads and board members, not with Marcus Sterling personally. Whatever history exists between you, this appears to be structured as genuine professional engagement. That detail surprised her. She'd expected Marcus to insert himself into every aspect of the project, to hover and monitor and ultimately control. Instead, the structure suggested he understood that she needed space to prove herself without his interference. "I need time to think about this," Elena said, though her heart was already racing with possibilities she hadn't dared consider in months. "Of course. But Elena, may I share one more observation?" She nodded. "Yesterday evening you served a table where one gentleman made inappropriate comments. I watched how you handled it, professionally, gracefully, without compromising your dignity despite being in a vulnerable position. That same strength that got you through that moment is what will get you through this opportunity." Elena touched her belly unconsciously, feeling movement that reminded her she wasn't making this decision alone. Her child deserved better than a mother who was too afraid to reach for possibilities, even when they came wrapped in complicated history. "If I accept this," she said slowly, "I need guarantees. No special treatment, no allowances for my condition, no intervention if I struggle. Either I succeed on merit, or I fail honestly. I believe those terms would be acceptable to all parties involved." Elena stood again, but this time her movement carried purpose rather than agitation. "I'll need to research the company's recent acquisitions, understand their corporate culture, develop a comprehensive plan that justifies this investment." "So you're accepting?" "I'm accepting the opportunity to prove that Elena Morrison still exists beneath all the damage," she corrected. "Whether that proves wise or foolish remains to be seen." James smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him since the conversation began. "I suspect it will prove both wise and transformative." As Elena left the restaurant that afternoon, the proposal tucked carefully in her bag, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not the dread of another shift or the anxiety of unpaid bills, but actual excitement about using her mind for something beyond basic survival. The bus ride home felt different, charged with possibility rather than resignation. She began mentally cataloging resources, considering approaches, remembering skills she'd convinced herself were lost forever. For the first time since Thomas Hartwell had disappeared with her life savings and her trust, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere endurance. Whether that future included any kind of reconciliation with Marcus remained uncertain. But for now, it was enough to remember that she was more than circumstances had forced her to become. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood outside the Sterling Enterprises boardroom, adjusting his cufflinks with uncharacteristic nervousness. Through the glass walls, he could see Elena setting up her presentation materials with methodical precision. She'd arrived an hour early, her pregnancy now more pronounced, but her movements confident and purposeful. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the exhausted server from the restaurant, replaced by a professional who commanded attention through competence rather than sympathy. She wore a simple but elegant maternity dress that spoke of careful shopping rather than desperation, and her hair was styled in a way that framed her face with authority. "Sir," Catherine, his executive assistant, appeared beside him. "The board members are ready to begin." Marcus nodded, though his attention remained fixed on Elena as she tested the projection equipment. She moved with the focused energy of someone who'd found her element again, and the sight filled him with pride he had no right to feel. "Has she requested anything special for the presentation?" he asked. "Nothing beyond standard audiovisual support. Though I should mention, she's already impressed several department heads with her preliminary research. The cultural programming proposal she submitted yesterday had marketing practically dancing in the hallways." Marcus smiled, despite his nerves. That was Elena, thorough, innovative, always finding angles others missed. It's what had made her such a respected curator before Thomas Hartwell had destroyed her professional reputation. "Mr. Sterling?" Elena's voice came from the boardroom doorway. "I'm ready when you are." Her tone was professionally neutral, giving no indication of their shared history. But Marcus caught something in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement that this opportunity meant everything to her rebuilding efforts. The boardroom filled quickly with Sterling Enterprises' senior leadership, 12 individuals whose combined decisions shaped the company's direction. Marcus took his seat at the head of the table, while Elena positioned herself at the presentation station with visible composure. "Gentlemen, ladies," Elena began, her voice carrying the authority Marcus remembered from gallery openings years ago. "Thank you for this opportunity to present cultural programming concepts for your Meridian Holdings acquisition celebration." She clicked to her first slide, revealing a stunning visual concept that immediately captured attention. "Rather than traditional corporate entertainment, I'm proposing we position Sterling Enterprises as a patron of emerging artistic talent while celebrating your expansion into sustainable shipping technologies." Marcus watched the board members lean forward with interest. Elena had clearly done extensive research into both the acquisition details and the company's broader mission statement. "The week-long celebration would feature 3 core components," Elena continued, advancing through slides that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of corporate branding and cultural positioning. "First, a traveling exhibition showcasing artists whose work addresses environmental themes, displayed throughout your office locations and shipping facilities." Victoria Chen, the marketing director, raised her hand. "How does art programming align with our business objectives?" Elena smiled, and Marcus recognized the expression from their early relationship, the look of someone who'd anticipated every possible question. "Excellent point. The environmental art exhibition positions Sterling Enterprises as forward-thinking on sustainability issues, which aligns perfectly with your new green shipping technologies. But more importantly, it creates content for social media engagement, community outreach, and employee morale initiatives." She advanced to financial projections that made several board members sit up straighter. The programming investment would generate approximately 3 times its cost in marketing value, while establishing Sterling Enterprises as a cultural leader in the business community. "Impressive," murmured Robert Hayes, the chief financial officer. "But what about execution logistics? This seems extremely complex for a single consultant to manage." Elena's composure never wavered. "I've already secured preliminary agreements with 5 galleries, 2 museums, and a dozen emerging artists. The implementation would involve existing Sterling employees in meaningful ways, creating internal investment in the company's cultural initiative rather than treating it as an external add-on." Marcus felt his chest tighten with admiration. Elena had crafted a proposal that was simultaneously ambitious and practical, addressing business needs while showcasing exactly the kind of innovative thinking that had made her gallery exhibitions memorable. "The second component," Elena continued, "involves transforming your annual shareholder reception into a cultural salon format. Instead of traditional cocktail networking, we'd create intimate spaces where business leaders engage with artists, creating organic conversation opportunities that strengthen business relationships while supporting cultural development." She clicked to images of similar events, each more sophisticated than typical corporate gatherings. "This approach has been successfully implemented by technology companies looking to differentiate themselves in competitive markets. The result is more meaningful networking and significantly higher attendee satisfaction ratings." Victoria leaned forward with obvious interest. "You're suggesting we become known for events people actually want to attend rather than feel obligated to endure?" "Exactly. When Sterling Enterprises hosts cultural programming, you're not just another corporate sponsor. You're curating experiences that people remember and discuss. That translates directly into brand recognition and business development opportunities." Elena advanced to her final section, and Marcus could see her taking a subtle breath before continuing. This was clearly the component she considered most important. "The third element addresses long-term community engagement through an arts mentorship program. Sterling Enterprises would partner with local schools and community centers to provide artistic education in underserved areas, funded through a percentage of your cultural programming budget." The room fell silent as board members processed the implications. This wasn't just event planning. It was comprehensive corporate social responsibility wrapped in strategic marketing. "Ms. Morrison," said Patricia Williams, the head of Human Resources, "this mentorship program would require ongoing commitment and oversight. Are you prepared to develop that kind of sustained programming?" Elena's hand moved briefly to her belly, in a gesture Marcus recognized as unconscious self-comfort, but her voice remained steady. "I would be honored to develop and oversee such programming. Creating opportunities for emerging artists has always been central to my professional mission." "Even with your current personal circumstances?" Patricia continued delicately. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt his protective instincts surge. but Elena handled it with grace that left him breathless. "My personal circumstances include bringing new life into the world," Elena replied calmly. "I can't think of better motivation for creating cultural programming that benefits the next generation. The mentorship program would actually benefit from perspective that comes from understanding what we're building for the future." Marcus watched his board members exchange impressed glances. Elena had transformed a potential weakness into a strength, demonstrating exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made great consultants invaluable. "The total investment," Elena concluded, advancing to her final slide, "would be comparable to traditional corporate celebration costs, but with measurable returns in marketing value, employee engagement, and community positioning that extend far beyond a single event." She stepped back from the presentation screen, hands clasped professionally, waiting for questions or feedback. The boardroom buzzed with quiet conversations as members reviewed the materials she'd provided. Marcus found himself struggling to maintain professional composure. This wasn't charity or pity. This was Elena demonstrating that she was exactly as brilliant as he'd always known, despite everything that had tried to convince her otherwise. "Ms. Morrison," Robert Hayes spoke first. "This is significantly more sophisticated than we anticipated. You've essentially redesigned our entire approach to corporate celebrations. I believe Sterling Enterprises deserves programming that matches its innovation in business practices," Elena replied. "Standard corporate events don't reflect the caliber of thinking that built this company." Victoria Chen was already taking notes rapidly. "When could implementation begin? Because frankly, this makes our previous celebration planning look embarrassingly basic." "Implementation could begin immediately upon approval," Elena answered. "I've structured the timeline to accommodate careful execution rather than rushing toward arbitrary deadlines." Marcus realized his board members weren't just impressed. They were excited in ways he rarely saw during standard business presentations. Elena had given them something to be genuinely enthusiastic about, rather than simply approving. "I think I speak for everyone," Patricia Williams said, looking around the table for confirmation. "When I say this proposal exceeds our expectations considerably. The question isn't whether to approve it, but whether we can expand the scope to include additional Sterling facilities." Elena's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of the joy Marcus remembered from their early relationship. She was being recognized for her capabilities, not her circumstances, and the validation was clearly transformative. "I would be delighted to discuss expanded programming," Elena said, her voice carrying warmth for the first time during the presentation. "Sterling Enterprises has the resources and vision to become a genuine cultural leader in the business community." As the board members continued discussing implementation details and budget considerations, Marcus found himself studying Elena's face. The exhaustion and defeat he'd seen at the restaurant had been replaced by engaged enthusiasm that reminded him exactly why he'd fallen in love with her passion for her work. For the first time since their divorce, Marcus allowed himself to wonder if they'd both been different people then. Younger, less wise about what actually mattered in building a life together. 6 months later, Elena stood in the Sterling Cultural Center, watching children from underprivileged neighborhoods create murals alongside professional artists. The mentorship program had exceeded everyone's expectations, transforming empty corporate spaces into vibrant community hubs that buzzed with creativity and hope. Her daughter, baby Rose, slept peacefully in a carrier against her chest, while Elena coordinated the day's activities. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd named her child after the flower that symbolized new beginnings, and that's exactly what this little girl represented. "The mayor's office called again," James said, approaching with his usual protective smile. He'd left the restaurant to become Elena's business partner when her consulting firm began receiving requests from across the city. They want to discuss expanding the program citywide. Elena nodded, but her attention was drawn to a familiar figure entering the center. Marcus stood in the doorway, no longer the cold businessman she'd encountered at the restaurant, but someone who'd learned to find joy in things money couldn't buy. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, built on mutual respect rather than desperation or guilt. He'd proven his commitment not through grand gestures, but through consistent presence, helping with late-night feedings, attending pediatric appointments, celebrating every small victory in Elena's professional rebuilding. "The Federal Arts Commission announcement came through," Marcus said, joining them with barely contained excitement. "Elena, they've approved your proposal for the National Emerging Artists Initiative." Elena felt tears of joy threatening to spill. After Thomas Hartwell had destroyed her reputation, she'd never imagined working at the federal level again. But this program would support struggling artists across the country, preventing others from experiencing the vulnerability that had made her an easy target. "There's something else," Marcus continued, his voice softer now. David Chen found Robert Vance. The name still sent ice through Elena's veins, but she'd grown strong enough to face it. "And? He's been arrested in another state for identical schemes. The federal prosecutors want your testimony to help convict him for all his victims. There might even be asset recovery." Elena looked down at Rose, whose tiny hand had wrapped around her finger in sleep. This child would grow up knowing that justice existed, that predators faced consequences, that survival could transform into triumph. "I'll testify," Elena said firmly. "Other women deserve closure too." Marcus's eyes shone with pride and something deeper, love that had matured beyond their youthful passion into something sustainable and real. "Elena Morrison Sterling," he said, and she smiled at the name they'd chosen together. Not a return to their old marriage, but a new partnership built on who they'd become, rather than who they'd been. "I have something to ask you," Marcus continued, pulling out a simple ring, not the massive diamond from their first engagement, but a modest band with Rose's birthstone. "Not because you need rescuing, but because I can't imagine building anything meaningful without you beside me." Elena looked around the cultural center filled with children discovering their artistic voices, at James beaming with grandfatherly pride, at Marcus holding his breath for her answer. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, because we're not the same people who failed before. We're better." As they kissed, surrounded by the laughter of children and the scratch of pencils on paper, Elena felt the final pieces of her broken life click into place, not restored to what they'd been, but transformed into something stronger. The little girl against her chest stirred, opening eyes that would see a world where her mother was respected, loved, and valued for exactly who she was. Rose would grow up knowing that endings could become beginnings, that failure could become wisdom, and that love was worth rebuilding when it was built on truth. Outside the cultural center, the city hummed with afternoon energy. But inside, surrounded by art and hope and second chances, Elena had found something more valuable than her lost fortune. She'd found her way home to herself. And sometimes, that's the most valuable treasure of all.